Leadership is defined by your character. You can have all the ability in the world, but if you don't have good character, you're not going to be a great leader. Don't be driven by ambition, be driven by calling, and prepare yourself for when that call comes.
Hello, and welcome to Working with me, Dan Doriani, hosting a podcast where we explore faith, work, culture, and the way believers can make a difference in their corner of the world. Well, good day, everybody. Welcome to a podcast on working and faith called Working. And my guest today is my new friend, Gary Palmer, who happens to be a congressman who represents the 6th District in Alabama, where he has lived his entire life. He even played football for the University of Alabama, played for the legendary Bear Bryant, but much more to the point, he got his training here, his education here, his first jobs here, and maybe the first one that we would know about that led to his current position in life is the Alabama Policy Institute, which actually had a roots in earlier callings. But Gary, you did not ever plan to be a politician. You were operations management, you were an engineer. Just tell us a little bit about the Alabama Policy Institute, and then I want to dive into policies almost right away.
Well, when I worked for 2 international engineering companies, and the second one I really liked. I love building things. I love problem solving. But I decided to go to seminary. I never had any intention or any calling to be a minister, but I just loved the study of the Word. I would compensate the company for taking time to go to seminary class. It was one day a week by coming in at 6:30 in the morning. Mm-hmm. And we were, my wife and I listened to Focus on the Family, Dr. James Dobson, and one of his programs, he said he was hosting a special conference for Christian counselors. He gave the criteria. He was only going to take 25 people. He was taking applications from all over the country, and I thought, that's nice. The program ended, turned off the radio, went back to work, and a little bit, the phone rang, and it was my wife. And she said, "Did you hear the broadcast?" And I said, "Yes, I did." She said, "Are you going to apply?" I said, "No, I'm not." She said, "Why not?" And I said, "Well, first of all,
I have a job.
I have a job in engineering. I might need counseling, but I'm not qualified to counsel, and he's only taking 25 people. I wouldn't have a chance." And she said, "Well, you've been praying for God to open a door. Don't you think you could open that one?" Long story short, I called them, this pre-email. They sent me an application. I filled it out, sent it in. They called me and interviewed me, and 3 weeks, a day later, I got a letter saying I'd been accepted. And Dan, I literally lay awake all night.
Trying to decide what to do.
Well, I grew up dirt poor. Mm-hmm. And my wife used to tell me I wouldn't quit my engineering job because I was so afraid I'd be poor again. And I knew I had to choose. Mm-hmm. And one of the managers at the company was a member at Briarwood at the time. I went to see him to tell him about the opportunity, and he was very impressed, very sympathetic, but said the project I was working on, the client wouldn't understand.
Right.
And so I knew I had to make a decision.
Right.
And we were sitting in our living room one Sunday night after service, and Ann asked me, "What's our purpose?" And I said, what I thought was a weak answer. I said, "Well, it's to help people." Okay. She said, "If going out there saved one marriage or led one person to Christ, would it be worth it?" And I resigned the next day.
Mm-hmm. It's good to have a wife who tells you the truth, isn't it?
You got to be careful what you say about things in front of them, because they might bring those words back.
They might do that. My wife says, "Now remember when you said,"
yeah, and
it shows we're listening, we're having real conversations, which is great.
I think they're not just listening; they're taking notes.
Well, and they remember what counts often. Mm-hmm. So you went to Focus on the Family,
right,
and eventually that led to you starting a Family Policy Institute here in Alabama. You never did become a counselor, but you became sort of a leader of a think tank, which led to a think tank. You know, the Policy Institute is probably considered the number one conservative policy institute or think tank in the state of Alabama, maybe in the entire South.
It's one of them. After we started the Family Policy Council, I was invited to a meeting, oddly enough, in Colorado Springs, and Focus on the Family had just moved from California to Colorado Springs. And it was a meeting to discuss the idea of setting up a national network of conservative think tanks that covered the whole spectrum. And they elected me to the board, and then we agreed to serve 3 2-year terms. And my last 2 years, they elected me chairman of the board. And when we first started out, we could have met around one big conference table. Mm-hmm. There's now 65 state-based think tanks with combined budgets between $350 and $400 million. So it was a very successful effort. Mm-hmm. Alabama Policy Institute, now under the leadership of Stephanie Smith, is really doing a great job. And what a lot of people don't realize at the state legislative level, unlike Congress, you don't have a staff in most of these states, and particularly in Alabama. So Alabama Policy Institute really served a much-needed role in providing them with clear-headed, straightforward, fact-based information to help them make good decisions.
Right. Actually, the state I usually live in, Missouri, is similar. The staffing is good, but it's certainly not robust. You don't have staffers looking at everything for you, so you need information. If I may say, you have a reputation. I'm not sure what photographic memory means exactly, but you have something close to total recall for factual matters and policy matters, which is a good help. And if you can use that to help get information out that you can rely on your memory instead of having to look things up all the time, that's a benefit. It's a God-given gift.
It is. Doesn't always make for engaging conversation. That's right. I tell people that's why I rarely get invited out for anything social. Is my repertoire for conversation is generally policy related, but
yes,
I'm trying to do better.
Well, you have a reputation for being a policy wonk here in this building, Briarwood Presbyterian Church, for growing and growing and growing as a representative from policy alone, we might say, to speaking persuasively about policy and getting things done. Now, I do happen to know that you are, congressmen come in different shapes and sizes, and perhaps in districts that are more disputed, where the election can go either way, a congressman has to spend a lot of their time just making sure they're not losing an opportunity to be reelected and making sure they're not alienating their constituencies. This district is one that has elected you around 75% every time. So if I may say it this way, you have more freedom to work on policy. And you seem to be, to me, one of the most policy-driven congressmen or senators I've ever known. I've known a number, not a huge number. You always seem to be working on a serious policy matter. First time we had a serious conversation was after church. It was a couple days after Presidents Trump and Zelensky had a pretty fiery exchange caught on camera in the White House, and we chatted about it afterward. And I'm going to condense our conversation and say, you were kind of unhappy with both men. You said Zelensky should have come prepared by reading Trump's Art of the Deal. He didn't come to make a deal. He came to ask for things. And Trump said, you don't have any cards, which wasn't really true, but he didn't show he had any cards. And Trump seemed to be unaware that Russia was not only killing, but even maybe targeting Ukrainian evangelical Christians. Mm-hmm. And you said to me something to the effect that you're gonna do something about this. And a few days later, Franklin Graham, your friend and Trump's friend, was in the White House talking to Trump about the importance of defending Ukrainian believers and Ukraine, therefore, in general. So that's a background. I want to let you comment in whatever way you would wish about how a congressman gets involved and can help in matters like that.
Well, I've over time established an international network. And I when the war first began in Ukraine, I think just about everybody thought Russia would be in Kyiv within 3 weeks.
Right.
And I have a very good friend, a guy named Bill Hightower, who now lives in Nashville, that had worked in Brussels and had been very involved in the European prayer breakfast. And Ukraine had sent a delegation to our national prayer breakfast. There were probably 40 members of the Ukrainian parliament there. And I called Bill and I said, I need to set up a Zoom call. I need to find out what's really happening. Mm-hmm. And I hate to say this, it sounds partisan, but I really didn't trust the intelligence coming from the Biden administration.
Okay.
So he got in touch with a former member of the Ukrainian parliament and got a current member on and a couple of others. I had 2 or 3 members of Congress on with me. And that was on a Monday, I think. And then that Friday, I did another one and had several other members, including Kevin McCarthy and Steve Scalise, names that a lot of people would know.
Members of Congress, just to make it clear, right?
In leadership.
U.S. Congress.
Leadership people.
Yep.
And I told them I needed to get one of their military commanders on. In about the space of about 7 days, I did 3 Zoom calls with Ukraine. And we had over 130 members of Congress on that third one.
Wow.
That's what I think prompted Zelensky to then himself do the Zoom calls. I'd made some recommendations about how he should approach us. I was trying to help broker some arms shipments for street fighting because we, like we said, we thought
anticipated street house to house.
Yeah, we thought that's what was going to happen because from my conversations in those 3 Zoom calls, it was absolutely apparent to me that the Ukrainians were going to fight to the last man.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a long history here of conflict between
Yes,
Russia and Ukraine that most people have no idea about. So as we all know, it turned out differently, but I kept being involved with Ukrainian officials, and when things kind of went south for them here in the U.S. in terms of money and weapons, I suggested to them that they needed to offer to buy weapons from us to take a page out of what Britain did pre-World War II, pre our involvement in World War II. And,
which we could forgive if we chose to later on,
but the British paid it off in 2006.
Yeah,
They paid,
I remember that.
They paid off the Lend-Lease. And I said, put up your critical minerals as collateral.
Right.
And so to get to where the meeting, I was very excited that we were about to sign this deal. And I think Zelensky had a meeting with some senators from the other party. Mm. And they, one of them in particular, told him that he should try to get more. And Zelensky really doesn't know President Trump. He's had a few phone conversations with him. And he misread the room. Mm-hmm. And as I saw that unfolding, it was incredibly disappointing.
It was very difficult for everybody.
Well, I called
to watch, yes,
my main contact in Ukraine and told him what a mess this had turned into. I called one in London and expressed my extreme disappointment with how Zelensky had handled things. But we've got it back together. And then the point about what Russia's doing, there are a lot of people here have no idea the savagery, the barbarism that has taken place in Ukraine, perpetrated by order of Putin.
Yes.
The guy's former KGB.
Yeah, he's vicious.
He's a vicious person. He's a murderer.
Right.
And they are targeting evangelicals. There were 2 evangelical pastors in a vehicle headed to a camp to provide aid, not military aid, food, medicine, that sort of thing.
Right.
And they took them out with a drone strike. They knew who they were. Hmm. I've met with other pastors who've lost their families.
Right.
One pastor lost his wife and 2 kids. They've targeted evangelical churches. They've ransacked churches in the occupied areas. This is obviously not a religious war. This is a national conflict between Ukraine and Russia.
But there is a religious element.
There is a history there. There is a religious element there. And the Russian Orthodox Church in Russia, and this may offend some Russian Orthodox here, but
so you know this. I mean, my family's Russian Jew, came from Russia. We escaped from the KGB. KGB oppressed my family. Mm-hmm. So you go right ahead. We're allowed to be candid.
Well, they're corrupt.
Yes.
And they want to destroy any evangelical movement because it undermines power. And in any war,
they've sold out. They've sold
power.
out to political power.
Yeah.
The Russian Orthodox Church has fused with the state, no question.
But I think President Trump realizes what's going on. He can't trust Putin. I think he made a good faith effort in regard to Iran.
Yes.
To try to get them to dismantle their nuclear weapon program. And there is no way that Israel was ever going to allow Iran to have nuclear weapons.
So this podcast will be aired in a couple weeks, but we're talking today right after last night. Mm-hmm. Israel dropped hundreds of bombs on 100 sites in Iran, because according to, now look, I only read the newspaper, you know much more than I. They were, maybe 2 weeks away from having nuclear weapons, according to what I read. I'm sure your information is vastly better, but you may not be able to say anything more about it. I don't know.
Well, we knew where they were in the enrichment process and that they were very close to having multiple weapons. I've been anticipating, particularly in the last week to 10 days, that this was going to happen. I shared that with a few people that on a need-to-know basis.
Right. This would be specific classified information
that
you can't describe here.
I get information from other, when the war in Ukraine, probably a year or so, I was getting intelligence from foreign sources that actually was better than what we were getting from Biden, honestly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Speaking of these sorts of matters, it is true, if I can just follow up a little bit and move on to something else about the areas where you work, it is true that shortly after that event in the White House, President Trump did become aware of how much Russian forces are targeting evangelical Christians. Your friend Franklin Graham did convey that news to President Trump. He was aware of that, and I'll let you comment as you're able to comment.
Well, I think President Trump is frustrated with both sides because I think President Trump genuinely is a man of peace.
Yes.
He's more about prosperity. And every deal that he makes is kind of focused on how can people prosper?
Right.
How can people live together? He is about the deal. I mean,
Yes.
that's why I thought Zelensky, if he had read The Art of the Deal, he might have had a better sense of how to conduct himself in the Oval Office. I don't know how he's going to respond to this because we now have this situation in Iran.
Yes.
And what happened last night is just the beginning.
Yes.
What happened last night will be studied for years.
Yes.
Because it was not just air forces. I think there were probably people on the ground. I'm not going to.
Right.
I can't say definitively, but
Sure.
The targets and the individuals that they took out would have required
People on
information
the ground.
on the ground.
Right.
That to make those that precise.
Yes.
But it's not over.
Right.
That main facility where they were planning to build their weapons is very deep underground, very difficult to get to, and so I think they're going to have to inflict damage in other areas to convince the Iranians to give that site up.
Yes. Yeah, these are complicated matters. So you serve in a variety of committees. I don't know how much you want to comment or how much people know, but the work of Congress largely occurs in committees and subcommittees. Mm-hmm. One of your subcommittees includes rare earth metals or minerals, elements. They go by different names. If I could just give a quick summary, rare earth minerals, metals, elements are scattered thinly throughout the crust of the earth. They're not all that rare. They're about 17 elements.
That's right.
And then a variety of combinations.
You've done your
homework. I've studied the periodic table. Yes, I have done my homework. They're scattered widely. It's not that they're all that rare, but they're not clean deposits, which means it's enormous effort to refine the ore in which it occurs. And it also means there's a lot of pollution that's come out of the ground, which means we're not going to do it in America. It means that China, I'm going to exaggerate, which doesn't seem to care a whole lot about pollution in its own nation, does have those minerals and produces, you told me while we were chatting beforehand, 94%. That's a security issue. Talk to us a little bit about what can a congressman do about being beholden to an antagonistic nation that produces materials we need for electronics, for defense, for batteries, for innumerable products that we depend on every day?
Well, it really came into focus for me during COVID when China cut us off from personal protective equipment, PPE. Yes. And President Trump and President Biden then implemented what's known as the Defense Production Act. They declared a national emergency, and they literally told some companies that were making certain products, you're not making those anymore, you got to make this. Mm-hmm. And that's how we started meeting our supply. We also get 80% of our pharmaceutical agreements either from China or India. Mm-hmm. And that's also problematic. And then I started looking at these other issues, and again, coming from having worked in engineering and having been involved in huge projects, building factories or facilities, I realized that we were in serious trouble, Dan, when I found out that there's only 9 major refineries for rare earth elements in the world, and right. none of them are in the Western Hemisphere.
Right.
If I said there are none in the United States, that'd be bad enough.
Yes.
But there's none in the West.
And none in friendly hands.
Those 9, 8 of them are in China. The 9th one is in Malaysia, and it's a private company owned by a company out of Australia.
Which is not to say Malaysia is unfriendly to the United States, but it's not a close ally of the United States.
Well, Australia is, and it's an Australian company, but Malaysia I would not put them in the absolutely dependent, reliable category.
Yes, right.
And so I started working on this, and you're right about rare earth elements. They're subsurface or on the surface. They're in coal ash from coal-fired power plants. They're in mine tailings. And there's two processes. 3. You've got to get them off the ground or out of the ground. You've got to process the aggregate to get what you need then to refine. And the refining process is pretty difficult. And it's a very high energy demand process. And there are different types of rare earth elements. They're heavy metal rare earths and then the mid to light. Mm-hmm. And you can't use the same refining process. So
the lanthanides and lanthanoids.
Yeah. So
And
we're
one's much heavier than the other.
yeah, and some of them are radioactive. Now you mentioned China; they've got people working on the radioactive material with a sheet in front of them. Here, they've been full protective gear.
Right. So their costs, financial costs, the human costs are higher, but their financial costs are lower.
But we found from COVID they don't care.
Right.
And so what I've embarked upon is a Western Hemisphere alliance,
Right.
as a soft power alternative to China. I was asked...
Soft power meaning influence, friendship, partnership.
Right.
And a prominent nation here is Guatemala.
Right. And it took off beyond anything I thought. Started out with a conversation with the former Canadian ambassador to the United Nations, Louise Blais, and we were talking about a North American compact to secure these critical minerals and rare earth elements and do all this ourselves.
Mostly Canada and the United States.
Yeah, mostly Canada and the United States. And then I was invited to have dinner with the Colombian ambassador, Juan Carlos Pinzon, who's running for president of Colombia. The election's next May. And he invited me back and had about a dozen diplomats from Latin America there. CIA was there, General David Petraeus was there, State Department was there. When that dinner was over, I called Ambassador Blais and I said, we're no longer talking a North American compact, we're talking a Western Hemisphere alliance. Yep. And then I was asked to speak at a global energy summit. And this was probably a year or so after the war in Ukraine. And you remember energy prices had spiked.
Right.
The Biden administration tried to blame it on the war in Ukraine. And so I'm speaking, there are all these diplomats from around Europe. And I said, the war in Ukraine did not create the energy crisis. It exposed it. But it also exposed something else. It exposed the fact that no nation should be reliant on an adversarial nation for anything that's critical to its economy and national security as energy. And I've since added rare earth elements. And it was like somebody pulled the curtain back. I've had so many diplomats from Europe, West Central Asia, Indo-Pacific, Latin America, I've lost count.
In other words, everybody saw the same problem, but no one was addressing it because no one was addressing it. And once someone said, and gathered a group of people, say, we have a major problem here. Rare earth elements are essential to, vast swaths of the Western economy.
Well, a lot of people don't understand is, and I was invited to speak to a panel, be on a panel with some members of the European Parliament, and I said, look, competition is not between the U.S. and Canada, it's not between the U.S. and Europe. It's between the West and China. We're all in this together. And we've got to figure out how to resolve this together. So what I'm pushing, and I think we're making great progress. I'll be meeting with the White House week after next about this. But we've got a plan to move forward, and we can do this here.
Meaning
in the United States.
In the United States.
But
despite the concerns about pollution and all the regulations we have?
Well, the first engineering company I worked for was Combustion Engineering in their Environmental Systems Division. And I can tell you, Dan, that we have the technology that's far superior to anybody else in the world for pollution control, for maintaining high environmental quality. And that's what we'll do. It runs the cost up. And I was having this discussion with someone on one particular critical mineral, and they said, well, China puts it on the market for $2 a pound. Over here, it would cost us $8 a pound. And I pointed out that if things went sideways with China and we wound up in
it would be a lot more than $2 a pound.
$8 a pound would be a bargain.
Yes.
And so we're moving in the right direction on this. Yes. And then you brought up Guatemala. I'd gone down to Guatemala in August of 23, had dinner with the president. And then when President Trump got elected, he appointed Marco Rubio as Secretary of State, and that was a brilliant choice, particularly considering China's influence in Latin America. And Secretary Rubio's first trip as Secretary of State was to Guatemala, El Salvador, Costa Rica, and Panama. A month later, I led the first congressional delegation down there, met with all four presidents.
All four presidents mean the current president and the three prior presidents who are still alive. The four presidents of those four nations.
Yeah, and I've been on several foreign delegation trips where you might go to 4 or 5 countries and you might meet one head of state.
Right.
We met with all four, including Bukele and El Salvador. Very impressed with what they're trying to do. They've got a long way to go. They've got a huge amount of obstacles to overcome. But one of the things
like the energy grid, which is one of your specialties.
Exactly. One of the things that we should learn from China was that in the 1980s, they embarked on a major effort to build out their power grid to support manufacturing and industry. From 1990 to 2020, they raised over a quarter of their population out of poverty into the middle class. and added almost 8 years to their life expectancy.
Because of reliable energy.
Reliable
allowing
energy.
manufacturing and higher quality jobs and so forth.
Exactly, better health care. We could do the same thing in Central America and South America. And it not only is a national security benefit, but it's an economic benefit because, Dan, there's 700 million people live in Latin America.
Right.
Be an enormous marketplace for us over the next quarter century.
A partnership that benefits everyone.
And that's what I mean by soft power alternative.
Right.
We're better than China.
Yes.
We're better in our engineering. We're better in our construction. We're better in our relations because, again, taking a page out of what President Trump tries to do is if you can help people become prosperous, they become more peaceful.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a great point. And how do I want to say it? The Western market economy or the capitalist system, we call it a market economy, just builds spontaneous friendships, spontaneous alliances, lives and industries and nations become intertwined. You don't have to operate from the top down, from a centralized planning approach.
Right.
You know, it's how cities spring up, relationships spring up, industries spring up when you have an environment that allows them to flourish.
Well, government programs depend on the government and power at the time, and those come and go.
Right.
But these collaborative private investments, those relationships will last decades.
Right. Beneficial for all.
Yep.
Let me ask you a slightly different question. How do you work on, you're in a committee that oversees the federal budget and prevents waste. You know, we're not casting aspersions on anybody. We're not accusing anybody of corruption. Even if everybody's well-intended, nobody's deliberately corrupt in the government or at the higher levels, it's easy to have a lot of government waste. How does that happen? What can we do about it? It's one of your interests. It's the subcommittee you're on.
I've been working on this since I've been in Congress. We're sending out somewhere between $250 and $300 billion per year in improper payments. And I tell people we do everything in 10-year windows. That's $2.5 to $3 trillion plus interest because every dollar, since we're in deficit spending, every dollar we're sending out improperly is a borrowed dollar. And I've been working with the Government Accountability Office. The Comptroller General is a guy named Gene Dodaro. We've been working on this, and most of the problem is administrative. It's antiquated data systems. It's failure to verify eligibility for certain programs. It's just administrative error. And when Elon Musk came in with his Doge team, I really thought Doge is the wrong name, the Department of Government Efficiency. That's not what we want. What we want is to bring the federal government into the 21st century in terms of its technology. And what I told Musk, I said, you've literally come in here with a handful of technically proficient people with 21st century technology on their laptops, written a few algorithms, and done better oversight of the federal government in about 8 weeks than we've done in 40 years. And part of what they did was they just started helping these various agencies within the same department, helping their computers to communicate with the other agencies.
Yeah.
And
one of the problems with the government,
that.
You're assuming here, is that for whatever reason, government agencies often have very old computers and very old computer systems.
Yeah.
And which you can't just buy your own computer because it's networks. You say, well, just buy your own computer. But no, it's got to be networked in. And antiquated systems create deficits of knowledge and information.
And open you up to getting hacked.
Right.
I mean, it's huge problems. The IRS has got some serious problems with their databases. Social Security, right now, the way they build their master file on death is a family member has to call in and say grandpa died or grandma died. And if they don't do that and the checks keep coming, that's why you have people that are still getting checks that are over 100 years old.
Right.
Because somebody said, well, I forgot to call.
Which, I mean, some people might actually forget.
But we're working on that, and I think we're making progress. But it's difficult because in the federal government, a problem pops up. The solution is always to create a new agency and hire more people instead of saying, well, maybe we ought to bring our technology in the 21st century.
Right. Give people, not more people, but better equipped people.
Yeah.
That's
better
right.
trained, better equipped.
That's good. Let's talk about your career a little bit. So you never expected to be in ministry. You took some seminary classes, never expected to be a counselor. But through Focus on the Family, you became interested in policy, which started out with family policy, then became general policy. you and I are about the same age. We have a lot of things in common. We both exercise at least 6 days a week, try to stay strong so we still have energy. You're in your 6th term as a congressman. You never expected to be a congressman at all. You know, people who are young and want to get involved in politics, maybe some things you said today might make someone who's youthful or even in middle age think, I'd like to get involved in politics. It doesn't always happen by aspiring to elected office. How on earth did you become a congressman at the age of, 60? And I have to say it, we went out to breakfast not too long ago, and I said as we went in, do we need to find a corner so we can operate undisturbed because you're a congressman? You said, oh, nobody will bother me. Because you're sort of 5'10", 175 pounds, and you wear a suit, and you look like, you don't look like a politician with a jaw and a booming voice and so forth. I'm very glad you're a politician. I'm very glad you're an elected politician. But it was not a natural path. How did it happen that you got elected?
So the whole public policy thing was a whole new deal for me. I mean, when I was at Focus, it was a 4-week program at Focus. And the last week we're there, former Vice President of Focus, Tom Menery, stopped me in the hall and said, "You're from Alabama, aren't you?" And I obviously with this accent, I kind of joked. I said, "Well, how did you know?" Yeah.
How did you know?
Yeah, how did you know? But I said, yeah. And he said, well, will you help us? We need some contacts. And I thought it was for fundraising.
Right.
And so I agreed to meet with their central region rep, a guy named Randy Hicks. And so we sat in Menery's office. And in the process, I told Randy, I said, they were in Pomona at that time, California. I said, you're 2,000 miles or farther from many of the people you're ministering to. Have you thought about having state-based or region-based extensions? And Randy looked up and said, you've been reading our notes. And he told me how they'd been setting up these family policy councils and already set up maybe a dozen. I knew immediately that's what I was supposed to do. That was the last day I was there. I flew home the next day.
Talk about God's providence, God's call. Yeah.
Flew home on Saturday. That Monday I called him and said, look, I'm not qualified to run it, but I'll help you as best I can.
Before long, you were running it.
And I'd never even been to our state capitol. So I just immersed myself, went to the library and just immersed myself into the issues. And within 2 years, we were the model organization. And like I said, just a couple of years after that, we founded the State Policy Network.
Which is much broader than family issues.
Oh, yeah.
Includes education. There was a recent
economics.
Wonderful law passed for education, freedom of choice here in the state of Alabama.
We wrote the first school choice bill in the mid-'90s, and it got passed, 30 years later?
Yeah, it took a little while.
That's the persistence part.
Yes.
But anyway, Spencer Backus was our congressman, and Spencer and I have been friends for a long time. And I'd gone out to Oklahoma. We had our State Policy Network annual meeting. It was in Oklahoma City, and I'd given a speech at the Rotary Club. I'd been on a panel with their Attorney General, and people started coming up to me and saying, you need to run for Congress. I got back here on a Friday. I've got some timberland in Lamar County near where I grew up. And so I went to the woods, and I just couldn't get it out of my head. So Sunday night, I just went in the closet and prayed and said, Lord, I don't want to go to Congress, and I don't want to live in Washington. And I said, but I didn't want to quit my engineering job to do this, and it's worked out. I'll go where you want me to go and do what you want me to do, but I need a sign. So I went to bed, got up the next morning shaving, got a text message, finished shaving, went over, picked up the phone. The message was Spencer Backus just announced he's retiring. And so the sixth seat was open.
And the next morning.
I had people saying, you got to run. And initially I said I would. And I did a lot of work in Washington. I did a lot with, the first real work I did in D.C. was on Clarence Thomas's confirmation. So I had meetings up there and flew home on a Friday morning, absolutely convinced I was not going to run. Okay. And the managing chairman of the Alabama Policy Institute was Tom Bradford Jr., who's a member here and at Briarwood. And I told him, and he was not happy with me. He wanted me to promise not to make an announcement, pray about it through the weekend, and come see him first thing Monday morning. And I went home, sat down at the kitchen table with Ann, and Ann has never wanted to be in politics. And I thought she'd be relieved, and I told her I wasn't going to run. And she looked at me and said, I've heard you say for years what's wrong with the country is you can't get good people to run. She said, I've even heard you compare it to having to go to war. She said, how can you expect somebody else to go if you won't?
Yeah, that's a good question.
And then she said, I know this is not what we want, but I don't think it's about what we want. I think it's about what we're supposed to do. And she said, I think we're supposed to do this.
That's a call from God.
Yeah. And I know how to do it.
That's just the way it unfolds. You pray, you're not interested in something whatsoever. You ask for a sign, you get about as powerful sign as you can. You and your wife talked about this years ago. She remembers something you said, brings it up at a crucial moment. And so you began to run. And now, as I recall, you had very low name recognition. Your name is Gary Palmer, which is kind of a generic name, but it does sound a little bit like a golfer. Yeah. Arnold Palmer, Gary Player. You had something going, but it wasn't positive. So you were low on the name. People who knew you liked you, mm-hmm. and you were well known in your field, but you were not an entertainer. You weren't a world famous athlete. You didn't own a giant corporation. You didn't have the leg up that other people have. So it really did not look like you would be elected.
Yeah, my name ID 6 months before the primary was 4%. And it's funny you brought up the golfer, because half the people thought they knew me thought I was a golfer.
Yes.
So, but it worked out.
It worked out. It included preparation.
Yeah.
There was, I don't know how much you want to talk about it, but there was a debate in which I'll just say it became very clear that you knew policy better than anybody else who was running that year.
No. I talk to a lot of young people. I love doing this. If folks watching this ever in Washington, they contact my office, I take people on nighttime tours of the Capitol. Yes. And I love taking high school, juniors and seniors, college students. Because it's a historical thing, and,
right.
and there are lessons all throughout the Capitol. Mm-hmm. Literally, they're standing beneath the dome of the most powerful nation in the history of the world. Mm-hmm. History's being made right now. And the thing with so many people, Dan, is that history's changing. We're at a pivot point in history right now. Most people don't realize it.
Literally today.
Literally today. And so what I'll tell these kids is, don't be driven by ambition. Be driven by calling. And prepare yourself for when that call comes. And it takes patience. You're adding to your repertoire.
Yes.
But the most important things that I can tell you is leadership is defined by your character. Mm-hmm. You can have all the ability in the world, but if you don't have good character, you're not going to be a great leader.
Let me just dig into that for a second. There's an overlap between preparation and character, right? Mm-hmm. Because we've kind of hinted at this in this conversation, but you have to have resilience. You have to have perseverance. You have to be not easily deterred in what you believe in. Those are work characteristics, but they're also true character. That is to say, not easily deterred means you have strength of convictions. Mm-hmm. And also, showing you're most knowledgeable about policy is not something you gain by cramming for 6 weeks beforehand for a debate. It's not like
cramming for a test.
Exactly. So I've had other people on my podcast who have said something similar to what you're saying, who've achieved some level of public influence or literary influence, whatever the case might be, and they say, don't search for a platform. Do the work. If you do the work well enough, maybe a platform will come to you. I'm guessing you're in agreement with that.
I tell people that a couple of things. I got some little cliches that came to me is that you always heard experience is the best teacher, but what people don't tell you is it's usually a bad experience that
Yes.
you learn the most from.
Right.
Try to limit those.
Yes.
And then I tell people that smart people learn from their mistakes, but brilliant people learn from other people's mistakes. That's why you study history.
Yes.
And just, build this repertoire and make it broad. And it's like a tool belt. You're putting different tools in the belt so that when the time comes, you can pull out what you need at the right time.
Right.
It starts with and I think with faith. That's the defining thing for building great character. But also, you mentioned two other words. If you've got your character's built on faith, that gives you an ability to persevere that a lot of other people don't have. And it's going to require perseverance. You got to learn to deal with disappointment.
Yes.
I joke that playing football in college was great preparation for Congress because you had to learn to deal with disappointment. But you also knew you were going to get knocked down.
Yes.
And you only have two decisions. You either stay down or you get up.
Right.
But resilience. If you know what you're supposed to do, no matter how many times you get blocked, get back up. Mm-hmm. I read the Sun Tzu's book, The Art of War, and there's a
Yes.
section in it where these four young generals come up to him and ask that Sun Tzu teach them the art of war. And he told them to fill up these urns with water and follow them up a rocky hillside. And when they got to the top, he turned them around and said, now pour out your water. And they poured out the water and it goes rushing down the hillside. He said, observe the water. The rock so that it can move, it moves. The ones that can't, it goes around. That's life. Learn to live that way.
Yes.
But make sure that whatever objective is that you're pursuing, it's not about you. I had a freshman member ask me, said, how do you handle all this? And I said, well, the key is to learn to live not wanting anything. Now, that doesn't mean you don't have ambition or goals or things like that, but have the ambition of the right sort.
Yes.
But once people figure out what you want, if it's all about you,
yes,
it's a leverage point. And the addendum to that is never take anything you can't let go of, because then you don't have it, it has you. That's just a quality that I try to explain to young people, but I also really try to make a point that everybody has a purpose.
Yes.
That all of history is a tapestry that God has woven and every thread matters.
Well, yeah, behind all this is a belief in God's sovereign goodness and power, that you're called to something that you would not have sought, but you believe you see God summoning you, having overseen your preparation. Even if you didn't understand the preparation was occurring, God was preparing you for things. And then God's sovereignty when you're blocked. Again, the bill that allowed some freedom on educational choice, 30-year gap.
Right.
Which is a long time, but it still was accomplished, and it's making a difference.
10 years after I left.
In the lives of thousands of students. So you have
one last point on this.
Yeah, sure.
I know.
Sure.
I take them over to a statue. Each state has 2 statues in the Capitol. And one of Iowa's statues is to a guy named Norman Borlaug. And I take people over there and say, how many of you ever heard of Norman Borlaug?
Nobody.
Nobody. Won the Nobel Prize, Presidential Medal of Freedom, the Congressional Gold Medal. The guy obviously was very accomplished. And it's a statue of him in field clothes, little field hat. He's got his notebook. There's shocks of wheat behind him. What did Norman Borlaug do to deserve all that? He developed a hybrid seed that would grow in arid conditions, and literally billions of people have been saved from starvation because of his work.
Yeah.
So obviously he deserved a statue.
Yes.
But I said, if it hadn't been for a guy named Henry Wallace, nobody would have heard of Borlaug. He would have just been another Iowa State ag professor with some interesting ideas. But Wallace was also a graduate of Iowa State. Wallace's father was a professor at Iowa State. That's how he knew about Borlaug. And Wallace was the first Secretary of Agriculture in President Franklin Roosevelt's administration. That's when the Department of Agriculture was created.
Right.
Was later vice president, and it was Wallace that went to the Roosevelt administration and to Congress to get money appropriated to set up an experimental station in Mexico so Borlaug could do his work. So without Wallace, there's no Borlaug.
Right.
But the reason Wallace had such a great love for agriculture was there was another agriculture professor at Iowa State who was his father's best friend, and when Wallace was just a little kid, he'd take him out in the field with him to do his field experiments. And that guy's name was George Washington Carver. And I said, well, maybe you have Wallace looking over the shocks of wheat, and maybe you have Carver in his white lab coat and his little round glasses standing down beside at the base of the pedestal that Borlaug's standing on.
Yes.
I said, but then if it hadn't been for a couple of farmers in Diamond, Missouri, you would never have heard of George Washington Carver. And it was Moses and Susan. They were dirt farmers, subsistence farmers. Susan's best friend was a freed slave woman named Mary, and Mary was kidnapped and murdered. And Susan convinced Moses to trade their best horse, best farm animal, for that baby, for Mary's baby. And he went out and met them, gave him the horse. They gave him a burlap bag. That baby was in that bag. He took it out, opened his coat and his shirt. It was cold, tucked it in, walked back to the farm, and Moses and Susan Carver raised Mary Washington's son to be their own, got him educated, and saved billions of lives.
Wow.
And Dan, this is what I talk about, the tapestry of history that God has woven. No one who knew Moses and Susan Carver would ever in their wildest imagination thought they would have done anything significant. But that act of compassion, that ultimate pro-life act, saved billions of lives. And that's what I try to tell young people. You don't know what can be accomplished through your life. It might be decades, generations later, but live it to its fullest.
Yes.
And I tell them that because right now we've got the highest suicide rate ever recorded for people under 24. And so many young people don't have any hope. They don't have a sense of purpose. Every opportunity that I get, I'm going to speak a vision and a purpose into people's lives.
Well, I could say more and I could ask you more questions, but I think we've found a really good place to stop. So I'm going to say, Gary, I'm glad I've met you. and I'm glad you serve our nation, and I'm glad you give inspiring and truthful speeches to young men, young women, and serve our nation in ways that you've hinted at and many other ways. Glad to have you here today.
Well, Dan, it's been a pleasure to be on your podcast, and I'm really going to miss you. I hope you and Debbie consider this one of your homes and that you'll come back frequently.
We will be back. Thank you, brother.
Thank you.
Working with Dan Doriani is a production of the Center for Faith and Work St. Louis. We seek to promote faithfulness in the workplace, in education, in discipleship, and in the stories of believers who've applied their faith at work. If you want to put your faith to work and change your corner of the world, visit our website, the Center for Faith and Work St. Louis. Look for faithandworkstl.org. That's one word. We'll help you start a cohort with like-minded believers who also want to practice their faith at work. This podcast is donor-supported. To keep us going, please donate on our website. Maybe more importantly, you can support us by listening, by subscribing, by sharing, by liking us, by posting us on your favorite platform, or go old school and tell a friend.